The Battle of Helm's Deep is one of, if not the most, famous battle in the entirety of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. This entire exchange, from the setup to the battle to the finale, is around 40 minutes long in the extended edition of the Two Towers film. Peter Jackson spared no time or expense in the creation of this epic sequence, and it shows on film, as this fight set the bar for movies in the fantasy genre. However, its book counterpart is only a handful of pages, and if you know anything about Tolkien, that is really quite short. So how come the film adaptation of this event is so lengthy, taking up nearly 1/3 of the Two Towers movie? Well, as it turns out, Peter Jackson's version of this battle, however epic it might be, is almost entirely inaccurate. Everything from key characters involved, to the elves' appearance, to Gandalf's timely arrival with Éomer are completely changed for the film. So in today's video, I'm taking it upon myself to open up the pages of Tolkien's original epic saga and find all the differences between this incredible battle in the book and its legendary movie adaptation. My name is Gibby, and welcome to episode 31 of Movies vs. Manuscripts Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I go scene by scene through the Lord of the Rings movies and compare them to Tolkien's original books. This week is a little different, however, as I'm not going scene by scene this time. You see, Peter Jackson took multiple storylines and, like any good filmmaker would, spliced them together to keep the viewer up to date on all perspectives. Due to the constraints of a book, Tolkien's version splits up these narratives into their own chapters. So instead of going through the scenes little by little and creating 5-minute videos every week, I'm setting out to finish my analysis of the Two Towers in 3 final episodes. Part 1, The Battle of Helm's Deep. Part 2, Merry, Pippin, and Treebeard's involvement in the attack on Isengard. And finally, in Part 3, to finish off the movie, we'll look at Frodo and Sam's final scenes in Osgiliath and their release with Gollum. Anyway, that being said, this week we're taking all the remaining scenes showcasing our heroes at Helm's Deep and combining them all together. Before we dive into analysis, shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. As always, I give a shout out to one of you each week, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes as best I can across the 4 major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's refresh our memory on what happens in the film version of this battle. So picking up from where we left off last week, we see Aragorn riding Brago, who has just rescued him, and on his way to Helm's Deep, he sees the full force of Isengard marching to the keep. Upon his arrival, he is greeted and given back Arwen's necklace, and then he informs Theoden of the 10,000 that march upon them. At this, Theoden goes out and begins to give instructions, sending the women and children into the caves and recruiting all able-bodied men and boys. Aragorn advises him to send riders out for aid, but Theoden refuses, saying that they have no allies. We then see a scene in which Éowyn attempts to fight alongside Aragorn, and she declares her love for him. Then after, he tells her that it's not his order to give, so she goes with the women and children into the caves. The movie then cuts to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli in the armory with the men of Rohan as they are preparing, and Legolas and Aragorn get into it as Aragorn says that he will die as one of them. We then see Theoden standing in a heavenly light as Gamleen assists him in putting on his armor. Theoden recites some old poetry, and we get a montage of the Uruk-hai marching and the men and boys of Rohan being recruited. We then see Aragorn sitting on some steps as night falls, and then he comforts Hama's son Haleth, who believes that they won't live through the night. After this, Aragorn puts on his own armor and weaponry, and Legolas apologizes to him for his earlier comments. Suddenly, they are called outside as they find out that elves have come to assist them in their time of need, and now the battle begins. After a misfired arrow, the fight breaks out and we see many things, including an explosion, the death of Haldir, Gimli being thrown, and finally the retreat into the final keep. As dawn approaches, Aragorn takes leadership and encourages Theoden to ride out in a final act of honor and glory to buy the women and children time to escape through the mountain. Gimli blows the horn of Helm, and we witness Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas, and some other riders ride out through the Uruk-hai and carve a path onto the battlefield. At this moment, the sun is rising, and they see Gandalf at the top of a hill leading into the valley. With him is Éomer, and along with Gandalf, he and his men ride down into the remaining forces of Isengard and wipe most of them out. The final Uruk-hai run out of the valley into a forest which has suddenly appeared there and get eaten up by the trees. Finally, our last 2 scenes show Gimli and Legolas counting up their final kills, with Legolas at 42 and Gimli at 43. And then later, near the end of the film, we see Gandalf with the king and our members of the Fellowship looking out at Mordor as they're riding to Isengard. But as we know, we won't pick up from there until next film. For now, that ends things off with all the scenes we're covering today in regard to the Battle of Helm's Deep. Yes, it is quite extensive, and that means there's a lot of changes. So let's waste no time and get right into our first 3 categories of characters, timeline, and location. As for characters, we have a few things of note. First, Haleth is made up. Quick fun fact though is that the boy next to Haleth around the fire is Viggo Mortensen's son. Anyway, next we have the change of Gamling. In the book, Gamling is an old man who is looking after Helm's Deep in Erkenbrand's absence. He is not Theoden's right-hand man as shown in the movie, Hama is. And at this point, Hama is alive and well, but he'll soon perish in the battle. Next, Éowyn isn't supposed to be at Helm's Deep since she is at Dunharrow with the women and children of Edoras. So as we'll discuss in the plot changes, any scenes regarding Éowyn can be ignored for the most part. Also, the wild men of the mountains help the Uruk-hai attack Helm's Deep. In the movie, they just keep it to being the Uruk-hai, but the book is quite clear to include the wild men. Plus, we should note that the Uruk-hai in the book are mainly referred to as orcs, and we don't learn of their true names until an intriguing plot change that we'll cover later. Next, Éomer is with them the whole time. In the movie, he just shows up with Gandalf, but in the book, he has been with them since Edoras. And that brings us to the final character change, because on that same note, the movie removed Erkenbrand, who we'll talk more about in the changes as he is the one who arrives with Gandalf, not Éomer. Now on to timeline and location, there are only a couple of deviations. First, for timeline, the battle itself seems to be fairly accurate in terms of time. However, they skip straight from the battle to Gandalf and company at Isengard. The book has about 10 pages that detail the events after the battle, which the film omits, but we'll cover those changes at the end of this video. For location, the same change can be noted. The scenes cut straight from Helm's Deep to Isengard and skip their journey in between, which takes them through the fords of Isen. But that wraps up our first 3 categories, and now we can launch into the all-important plot changes, of which there is a record-breaking amount in this episode. But first, as always, I wanted to remind you that I can't cover every word spoken, so if you're looking to relive this dialogue for yourself, I'd encourage you to check out the link below and claim your free trial of Audible, which will get you 1 free audiobook. You can pick up The Two Towers or get ahead of things and get The Return of the King to prepare for our next film in this series. Anyway, let's dive into the changes. I want to set things up by letting you know that this will break down into 2 major halves. First, the preparation before the battle, as that takes about 20 minutes, and second, the battle and resolution itself, which is about another 20 minutes of the movie. So let's start with what comes on our screen first and talk about Aragorn and Brago. As we've discussed in previous episodes, this is a fabricated plot point for many reasons, which affects multiple changes in the coming scenes. So let's walk through these one by one. First, Aragorn never set a horse named Brago free from Edoras. Second, he never fell during a warg attack and therefore never needed to be rescued by Brago and never arrives at Helm's Deep separate from the rest of the company. In the book, he is with the king the whole time. Third, as we come to his scenes with Gimli and Legolas greeting him, this means that Legolas never gives him back Arwen's necklace, which as we've discussed before, isn't even in the original books anyway. And finally at number 4, he doesn't inform Theoden of 10,000 orcs marching from Isengard because he never saw them as he does in the movie. In the book, they are well informed of what's to come as the Uruk-hai were hot on the Rohirrim's tail as they rode through the valley to the keep. Plus, they had been warned by multiple messengers already. Next, we can move past this Aragorn-Brago fiasco and on to the ensuing events. We see Theoden readying for battle, and this is believable, although not specifically depicted in the book. But that's not where the change lies in my eyes, but rather in a comment that Gimli makes. He tries to inform the king that these aren't mindless orcs, but Uruk-hai. This is weird for one main reason, which is that Gimli and the rest of the peoples there aren't acquainted with these creatures. They are bred by Saruman, and it wouldn't have been common knowledge to know what they are. It isn't until later, as I mentioned in the character changes, that we learn of their names and who they are straight from the Uruk-hai's own mouths. The film takes on this perspective that everybody knows the distinction between normal orcs and these Uruk-hai, but in the book, they are called orcs up until the time when they reveal their true title. Next, we see Aragorn have a small disagreement with the king as he advises Theoden to send for aid. This doesn't happen in the book. The whole idea that Gondor is not going to help them is made up. Gondor is allied with Rohan, and we'll see more of this in The Return of the King. I think in reality, the battle just happened so fast that they didn't have time to discuss this. Plus, just like with the elves, which we'll address in a bit, Gondor is currently dealing with their own fights, not to mention they're several days ride away from Helm's Deep. But the main point I am making is that Gondor and Rohan are strong allies in Tolkien's books, but the movie plays up this alliance as weak. Something that rubs me the wrong way is when Theoden asks Aragorn, where was Gondor when the Westfold fell? Well, they probably had no idea what was happening considering you were a decrepit old man who was being controlled by Saruman, and you never sent for aid. It's just kind of a strange comment when it's entirely Theoden's fault that Gondor never came to help. As we know from the Faramir episodes, Faramir explained to Frodo and Sam about how Gondor was strong allies with the Men of Rohan. So this is just a weird comment. Anyway, next we have our moment of Éowyn declaring her love for Aragorn. Like I mentioned previously, Éowyn isn't there, so this is made up, although it adds a nice bit of emotion and drama to this battle. Next, we see different clips of men and boys taking up arms, and this isn't entirely inaccurate, although it's a little different in Tolkien's writings. In the book, Gamling is already at Helm's Deep, and he is the one who informs the king that most men have seen too many winters or too few. This is a line later given to Gimli as they're in the armory. And speaking of which, that brings us to Legolas and Aragorn's little tiff while in said armory. Simply put, this doesn't happen in the book. However, we do have a moment which the movie omits between Legolas and Gimli. Honestly, this part of the book further solidifies their friendship, as we'll see during the end of the battle, but before it starts, they share a nice moment of talking during the calm before the storm. The movie kind of shows this, although changing the words, by having us witness them out in the darkness and Legolas offering to find a box for the dwarf. However, in the book, this is what really happens. After arriving at Helm's Deep and preparations for battle being underway, Legolas and Gimli stand on the fortress and the dwarf mentions how the stone is more to his liking, as they've been on horses for a while now and he's enjoying the change of scenery, which is more similar to his home. Legolas tells him that he does not like this place, but having Gimli there comforts him, and that he wishes he had more of his kin among them. Then Legolas adds that even more than dwarves, he wishes they had archers from Mirkwood there to aid them in battle. Then after this exchange, the companions went to get some rest. Now in the book, after this paragraph, Tolkien goes straight into the battle and wastes no time. But before we get there, we still need to finish the first half of this analysis, which has a few scenes remaining in it. And our next change brings us to Theoden's famous "Where is the horse and rider" poem and his "Who am I, Gamling" line. This is never described in the book, and it is key to note that the king is much more courageous and ready for battle than what the movie displays. You can see my previous episodes on Theoden to learn more about this, but there's no denying that the movie dramatizes this character much more, making him brave but also having his own mental battle. As for the poem, this is pulled from Tolkien, as this is a poem of the Rohirrim which describes Eorl the Young, the first king of the Mark. Next, we have Aragorn's fatherly moment with Haleth, Hama's son. As mentioned earlier, Hama doesn't die by warg in the book, but rather he dies a noble death at Helm's Deep in battle. Because of this, there's no moment of Aragorn comforting Hama's son, Haleth, who for all we know doesn't even exist. The only Haleth I could find in Tolkien's lore was a woman from a completely different people group. If any of you know if Hama did have a son, let me know in the comments. Next, Legolas never apologizes since they never argue, and the elves never arrive. This would have been especially unrealistic considering that there was no way for them to know what was happening at Helm's Deep, let alone arrive in time. Plus, they were dealing with their own battle against the orcs from the mountains who were trying to invade Lothlorien. This is a part of Helm's Deep which gets a lot of people upset, and might be one of the most frequently commented topics on my channel. But in reality, there's not much to say other than that it's very inaccurate. Peter Jackson needed a way to bolster the amount of people defending Helm's Deep, and this is how he did it. In the book, there are already a decent number of men at the fortress with Gamling, and then Theoden and his entire host of men from Edoras show up and provide ample amounts of defense. Since in the movie it seems the only warriors are those already with the king, it helped to have the elves arrive to give the impression that there was some support. But like I said, this never happens in the book and would have been extremely unrealistic. I think those of you who are upset by this moment should just be thankful that Peter Jackson cut all of the Arwen scenes which he originally was going to add to this moment. Anyway, speaking of unrealistic, we can finally get to the battle itself, which has a critical change right at the beginning. The battle doesn't start due to a misfired arrow. What really happens is that the enemy had been slowly approaching and setting up camps in the valley as they progressed. Eventually, they made it to the fortress and charged on it, but got held back by a volley of arrows which took out many of the Uruk-hai. As the night progressed, Tolkien writes that the orcs and wild men of Dunland crashed and broke upon the walls time and again, each time getting closer until they made it to the front gate, but also each time losing a great number due to the volley of arrows. However, as the lightning would strike, a white light would fill the valley and display the thousands of orcs crawling everywhere and attempting to scale the mountains and walls. Now before I get further into Tolkien's version of events, which includes Éomer and Aragorn fighting side by side, let's go back to our film adaptation and cross off a few more fabricated moments. First, it's important to note that the Deeping Wall does get blown up in the book, but it actually happens after the scene at the front gate. We'll talk about that scene in a moment, but in regard to the explosion, it is referred to as the devilry of Saruman, and we aren't exactly told what it is, whereas the movie pretty much has already shown us that it's a bomb in an earlier scene with Saruman. Also, it's key to note that they use blasting fire more than once in the book, but the movie only shows them utilizing this power one time. Another key difference is that Aragorn doesn't get blown up with it, but rather jumps down into the pit after it happens, similarly to what they have Gimli do in the movie after the wall is blown. But don't worry, in a moment we'll talk about Gimli's real jump into the deeping area. Additionally, because there are no elves there in the book, there is no charge in which Aragorn goes forth with the elves to take on the onslaught of Uruk-hai, but it does look cool in the movie. Next, we have perhaps the most iconic moment of agility on Legolas's part, which is his shield surfing. I'm sorry to say that this stunt which defies physics does not happen in the book, but we will address another feat on Legolas's part which I think is a bit crazier in a few minutes. The next thing we see in the movie is their retreat to the keep, but we need to go slightly out of order here as the book has a different order of events. So before we move on with the movie scenes, let's rewind and talk about a key omission from the film, which is Éomer and Aragorn's stand at the gate. After the Uruk-hai had made it to the gate, Aragorn, who was on the deeping wall with Éomer, realized what was happening, and that the Uruk-hai were close to busting down the doors. So he and Éomer, together with a handful of men, went through a side door and leapt onto the path in front of the gate, fighting all the enemies in their path. Sound familiar? Well, that's because this is the direct inspiration for Aragorn throwing Gimli later in the battle sequence. Like I said, it's a bit out of order as Tolkien writes about this now in the book, but the key difference is the swapping of characters, as it is Éomer with Aragorn instead of Gimli. However, Gimli does eventually make his appearance. What happens is that after slaying many Uruk-hai, several turn to run, and while Aragorn and Éomer go to head back inside, a couple of orcs who lie on the ground suddenly came alive and grabbed a hold of Éomer. Right at that moment, Gimli shouted and leapt from the cliffside onto the path and slew the two orcs who had a hold of his friend. Then, after going inside, Éomer expressed his gratitude for the dwarf. It is after killing these two Uruk-hai that he goes to Legolas and declares his count of 2, and Legolas informs him that he's already at 20, but all of his arrows are now gone. After this, the paragraph changes and we get a description of the continued battle. The enemy used ladders and grappling hooks, much like the movie depicts, to get inside the walls of the fortress, and the men of Rohan continued to defend the best they could. This text ends with Gimli leaping from the deeping wall onto some Uruk-hai who had crawled through the culvert inside. This must have also been inspiration for Gimli's leap in the movie, although that happens after the explosion, whereas in the book, the explosion hasn't happened yet. Now we have another moment which was not included in the film, as the explosion happens quite quickly. After Gimli leapt down onto the enemy and killed them, Gamling, who was also behind the deeping wall next to the culvert, asked for the dwarf's aid in cutting the stone to clog up the drain, which was letting in too many enemies. Gimli did the best he could with his axe, and then he and Gamling rejoined Aragorn and Legolas on top of the wall. At this point, Legolas was at 24 kills and Gimli at 21. The battle continued to go on, and eventually Gamling made note that dawn would not be far off. However, Éomer remarked that dawn would not help them as many of the enemy were men who won't be afraid of the sun. Again, at this point, they don't know the Uruk-hai can fight in the sun and are hopeful that dawn will bring a retreat on part of the orcs. But now, finally, as they spoke of this, there was a blast of a trumpet and an explosion which caused the deeping wall to fall. And now we can return to some of our remaining scenes from the film. After this explosion, just like in the movie, they do indeed retreat. However, there's a slight difference in personnel. Once Aragorn makes his way inside, he rejoins Legolas, who asks where Gimli is. Aragorn says that he does not know, and Legolas comments that that is evil news, and then mentions he wanted to inform the dwarf that he's at 39 now. Aragorn then tells Legolas that if Gimli makes it back to them, he will have easily surpassed 39. After retreating in further, they talk to another soldier who informs them that Éomer is still in the deep fighting with some men and Gimli. Remember this because we'll come back to it in a moment. But our next change on the film side is that Haldir never dies since he was never there in the first place. Also, Theoden never gets stabbed at the front gate like we see after they retreat in the movie. This is a nice detail that adds to the severity of the battle, but it doesn't happen in the book. Honestly, it sounds like in the book, Theoden stayed back most of the time, commanding his men, not going on the front lines, which probably is a bit more realistic to what a king would have actually done. Next, as we discussed, Aragorn and Éomer are the ones who leap and defend the front gate, and then are joined soon after by Gimli. But in the movie, it is just Gimli and Aragorn, and Legolas pulls them up after. This rescue on the part of Legolas doesn't happen in the book, and in my opinion is more outrageous than the shield surfing. But nobody seems to talk about this incredible feat of strength on not just Legolas's part, but Aragorn's as well, as he has to hold on to a dwarf as he's being dragged up the wall. But anyway, our next change is that we come to the penultimate moment of Aragorn and Theoden in the keep during their seemingly final minutes of defense. There is a corresponding moment in the book, but it is vastly different for one outstanding reason. Theoden's demeanor is entirely different. You see, in the movie, they make it seem like Theoden has given up, and Aragorn is the one who's clinging to hope. This is not the case. Once again, they make Theoden somewhat weakened compared to his book counterpart. Although in the book he is pretty certain of their demise, he is the one who suggests riding out, not Aragorn. Aragorn, of course, is in support of this idea, but in the movie they give this suggestion to Aragorn, who's trying to bolster the king who seems to have completely lost his mind. Plus, another small change, which we learn in the next chapter of the book, is that Gandalf never specified a time when he would arrive at Helm's Deep. In fact, it is quite unlike him to give Aragorn that timeline in the movie, which we hear again in the scene as Aragorn suggests to the king to ride out as the sun rises. To skip ahead slightly in the book, after the battle, Éomer goes up to Gandalf and says that once more in an hour of need, Gandalf came unlooked for. Then Gandalf remarks, "Unlooked for?" and then he tells Éomer that he had told them he would meet them all at Helm's Deep, although he didn't specify an hour or day. Typical Gandalf. Anyway, to go back to the current moment, another change is that Aragorn doesn't take charge and give Gimli instructions about the women and children. However, they do make mention of the caves being a place for retreat where provisions are kept. Éomer, Gimli, and some other men who were fighting in the deep, as we learned earlier, were retreating into the caves as they were being attacked, and Theoden tells Aragorn that they can hold out there for a while, much longer than himself and Aragorn, who are stuck in the keep. So now we know where our beloved dwarf and Éomer are, and we'll see them later. Now we finally have our key exchange between Aragorn and the enemy while Theoden prepares his horses. In the book, after the king tells Aragorn that he's going to ride out, Aragorn goes and rejoins the fight. Then he goes to the edge of the keep and holds his hand out in sign of parley for the orcs to see. He then briefly talks with them and tells them to retreat or else they will all die. Of course, given the situation, they all laugh at him. He tells them that they do not know what the dawn will bring, and they tell him that they are the fighting Uruk-hai, and they are not afraid of the sun like other orcs are. Again, the Uruk-hai continue to jeer and laugh at Aragorn as he told them to leave now and never return. But his kingly air and confidence made the wild men of the mountain falter, as they don't have the same mentality as the Uruk-hai. It is then after this brief distraction that the Uruk-hai decide to press on and nearly burst through the final gate as they set up another explosion. But after the entrance is blown, the horn of Helm Hammerhand sounds, and that is our next small change, as the horn is blown, but Gimli is not the one who does it. It makes sense why they did this in the movie though, because it's another way to incorporate a main character instead of having some random soldier do it, especially since Gimli doesn't ride out on a horse. After the horn, just like in the movie, Theoden and Aragorn rode out with other men and they carved a path through the enemy, who at this point were trembling from the horn and this sudden outburst. Then, after riding through the orcs and wild men, the riders stopped as in amazement they looked through the valley and saw a forest now sitting where open fields once were. This scene in the movie is quite similar except for this one detail, as Tolkien is very specific in noting their amazement at seeing this strange sight. But before the forest gets any more involved, we have our final moment of battle, in which Gandalf arrives. After seeing the forest, Theoden and the others looked up and saw a white figure and tall man, and Theoden and his riders exclaimed, "Erkenbrand!" Remember, Éomer is with them at Helm's Deep, so in the book, the reinforcements Gandalf went to find were actually Erkenbrand and his men. Then, as the Horn of Helm continued to sound, Gandalf and Erkenbrand charged with the riders and overtook the orcs just like in the movie. The only detail changed would be the light shown in the blinded enemy as Gandalf charged. In my opinion, this is a great way to display the moment from the book in visual form, but technically Tolkien only wrote that the coming of the White Rider caused great fear in the wild men and orcs who fell to the ground. There's no mention of a blinding light, but that's not that big of a deal. Anyway, the battle had finally finished as Erkenbrand and Gandalf cleaned up the fight, with the remaining enemies running into the forest. At Gandalf's command, Theoden and his men steered clear of the trees and allowed them to do their work. But now that the battle is done, we still have a couple of omissions and alterations from the book, which starts with the scene showing Legolas and Gimli's final kill counts. In the movie, Gimli says he got 43 and Legolas says he had 42, but then shoots the Uruk-hai that Gimli is sat upon. But here's what happens in the book. After the fight, Éomer and Gimli, who had been in the caves defending themselves, came out and rejoined the others. Legolas was overjoyed to see his friend, who had a bloodied bandage around his head, and the dwarf informed his friend that his final count was 42. Legolas then told Gimli that he only had 41, but that he was not upset about the loss as he was simply glad enough to see his friend again. And now we have come to the final scene in the movie, which encapsulates many pages from Tolkien's writings which are left out. You see, after the fight, we have about a day of rest, and then their road to Isengard. Obviously, I won't cover what happens when they get there, because Peter Jackson saved that for the next film. But for now, let's cover everything missing in a quick lightning round of differences. At number 1, Theoden inquires about the trees, and Gandalf tells him that it is no wizardry of his, nor wizardry at all, that called these trees, but rather a much older power in Middle-earth. Second, Gandalf informs them that they should go to Isengard. Theoden is taken aback at this, as they have just had a great battle, and he expects thousands more orcs to be at Isengard, but Gandalf of course knows better. Theoden, although reluctant, tells Gandalf that he will indeed accompany him to Orthanc, since so far Gandalf's advice has never been wrong. Third, we learn that after this conversation, they went back to the keep to rest and sleep for the night. Erkenbrand took the remaining captive wildmen and put them to work, informing them that after they repaired the evil that they joined, they would be set free with an oath to never return. This amazed the wildmen, who had been deluded by Saruman and told that the men of Rohan were cruel and burnt their captives alive. Obviously, seeing that they were lied to, they joined in with the men of Rohan and helped to repair the damage. Fourth, we learn of Hama's death, and Theoden was the first to cast dirt on his grave, as he was greatly hurt by this loss. By the way, this was a much better death and burial than the warg killing him earlier in the movie. At number 5, after a day of rest, they went on to ride to Isengard, and passed through the new forest that had arrived outside the valley. They saw no remnants of orcs in the trees, and they felt a hot wrath amongst them, although they were left alone. Legolas and Gimli discussed the matter, and Legolas informed his friend that he shouldn't worry, as it's orcs they hate, not dwarves, men, or elves. And this spurs on a greater omission from the films, which is Legolas and Gimli's promise to each other. You see, after talking about the forest, Gimli tells Legolas about how it was a mighty chance that led him inside the caves of Helm's Deep. He then jests that the men of Rohan use it simply for a hideout, when little do they know that the caves in that mountain are one of the greatest treasures in the north. Legolas doesn't believe him, and tells him that he would pay to not go into those caves. But after Gimli goes on in poetic fashion about the mountain and how it glitters, Legolas tells him that they should make a promise. If they both come out of this adventure alive, then he promises to visit the caves with Gimli, and that Gimli should promise to visit Fangorn with Legolas. Next, at number 6, the movie omits their first run-in with Ents. As they rode through the forest, they came upon some eyes amongst the trees, which freaked out the whole company, but Gandalf informed them that they were simply Ents. They then witnessed the large troll-like figures walking along, and Theoden was blown away by these creatures. And finally, at number 7, their last point on the journey before reaching Orthanc brought them to the Fords of Isen. At this point, they saw the burial mound from the fight long ago, which claimed the life of Theoden's son, and they noticed something odd. The river, which usually was a rushing amount of water, was bare. As we know, this is due to the industry of Isengard, but the Ents' attack is foreshadowed in that just a couple paragraphs later, Tolkien writes that as the company rested next to the ford, it became filled with water once again. And after this, they continued on and passed a few notable places, which I think we'll keep for the Return of the King, as that is where we truly pick up on their journey as they visit Saruman and his tower. And on that note, the entirety of our analysis of the preparation, battle, and resolution of Helm's Deep is complete. And at this point, I think I have done plenty of talking, so I want to hear from you. What do you think about the book compared to the movie? They are quite different across all points of the story, yet the battle in the film is iconic and one of my favorite parts of the Two Towers adaptation. Do you enjoy this part of the movie, or do you wish they would have kept it closer to the original version? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes that you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.